My name is Ralph McInerney, and our speaker today is Laura Garcia, who is a professor of philosophy at Boston College, which is located in some eastern city that escapes my mind. Laura is a graduate of this university. She has a doctorate, that is, from the University of Notre Dame. She's married to Jorge Garcia, and they have taught in a variety of universities in a variety of ways, and are currently both of them at Boston College. Laura's academic, principal academic interest is philosophy of religion. She's one of the founders of Faculty for Life, and is a presence among Catholics in this country, both academically and para-academically. So I knew her as a student. Everybody still looks young to me, Laura does. It's a delight for me to present to you Dr. Laura Garcia.
Thanks a lot. It's always a pleasure for me to return here to Notre Dame, a place I know and love, and to people I know and love. Is that on? I don't know. Is this working okay? It says it's on, Ralph. Okay, you have to turn up something over there. Can everyone hear me?
That's only for videotape.
Oh, I see. So should I talk into this as well? Okay, well, okay, how's that? That's better probably. Okay, great. My topic today is really, in spite of the title, Love's Labor. It's not this year on sex, for instance, as I talked the last 2 years on that topic. And I wouldn't want to say I'm tired of sex, but I've changed my focus here a bit to talk about human work primarily, and I'm not going to try to draw any parallels between those. Okay, and also the poetry of the Pope, the current Pope, John Paul II, mainly poetry he wrote prior to his election to the papacy. I want to say up front, as a disclaimer, that I work in philosophy and not even aesthetics in philosophy, and therefore not in the arts at all or in poetry. And so various people have asked me, why did I think I wanted to do something on poetry? And I don't have a good answer for that. But I'm sort of hoping that you out there that are more familiar with other contemporary poets and with that genre can contribute some things in the discussion afterwards. So I'm sort of just offering it not as a final word or anything like that, but just as some suggestions. As pop singer Madonna puts it, we're living in a material world, even a materialistic world. A culture saturated with materialism measures the value of human work primarily by the object of work, its product or outcome, and these measurements normally reference some form of utility. In reaffirming that the primary value of work is the subject of work, the person, Pope John Paul II restores dignity and meaning to work and to workers in a surprising number of ways. The personalist conception of work secures the rights of workers on a broader foundation than that provided by thinner moral theories. It promotes persons over profits, restores equal dignity to every kind of work, and reveals the transcendent dimension inherent in every act of labor. Here, I'll first explore this personalist understanding of the world of work, focusing especially on its countercultural assessment of the value of manual work, including work traditionally carried out by women in the home. In the second section, I discuss the poetry of John Paul II and the way in which this artistic meaning can set before us the meaning of work through impressions, or artistic medium, can set before us the meaning of work through impressions and images that speak more eloquently than any syllogism. A poem is not an argument, but a revelation. In the third encyclical letter of his papacy, Laborem Exercens, on human work, John Paul II insists upon a number of workers' rights that are occasionally praised but seldom practiced. These include working conditions that respect the workers, putting them first, a minimum of mind-numbing routine tasks that leave no room for initiative or creativity, protection of workers, their health and safety, opportunities for advancement, especially through further training or education, a just wage, even a living wage, policies that promote the workers' family relationships, respect and dialogue between labor and management, and flexibility for workers, especially those caring for young children or other dependents. One might measure the moral temperature of a nation's economy by its worker friendliness. America shows recent signs of progress on some of these policies, especially those that are believed to enhance worker productivity, of course, but much remains to be done. So I'm going to begin, however, more on, not so much on those practical applications or implications, you might say, of this theory, but on the theory itself about the value of work and where it resides. Personalism might be thought of as treating as a fundamental first principle the truth that persons are more important than things. The value of objects, apart from the general good of their existing, lies primarily in their relationships to conscious beings. We judge their worth in terms of their usefulness or cost or rarity. And these qualities are variable and dependent on the current social situation. The value of persons, on the other hand, rests in the kind of being they are, so it is both intrinsic to them and equally present in every member of the kind. Recognizing the freedom and consciousness of a person, that he is a subject and not a mere object, entails an obligation to respond to him as a subject and not an object. Free beings cannot be instrumentalized to ends outside themselves. Any attempt to do so is doomed to frustration, since they continue to seek their own ends, and violates the nature of persons as transcending the material realm and as having an end that's achievable only through their free actions. With these ontological and moral principles as a starting point, many of them, of course, drawn from St. Thomas, John Paul II draws several implications for economic and social relations. The first of these is, and I have a handout which some of you may have received, and I think that some of these are on your sheet. Human work is a key, probably the essential key to the whole social question. A quote from Laura McPherson's, which is itself the project of making life more human. The social question is how to make life more human. Contrast this view with its leading competitors in the intellectual marketplace, which proclaim that the social question involves how to make life more comfortable, or how to maximize options, or wealth, or power for an individual or for a nation. Making life more human requires something richer and deeper, keeping one's eye on the fact that human persons are the ends and material things are only the means. This leads to a further personalist principle that work is for man and not man for work. The goal or purpose of work is always man himself, so the Holy Father tells us in this encyclical, even if the common scale of values rates it as the merest service, as the most monotonous, even the most alienating work. It's his description. Even if the common scale of values rates it as alienating and monotonous, he says, still, the purpose is always man himself. The moral value of work derives from the fact that the one who carries it out is a person. And persons defined this way by John Paul II, a subjective being capable of acting in a planned and rational way, capable of deciding about himself, and with a tendency to self-realization. And this is true, I think, even in an age of more mechanized work, since technology has to be planned and implemented itself by persons. One way to avoid treating workers in the manufacturing sector as mere cogs in the machine is to encourage creativity and a sense of ownership in the product and in the company. Another is to support labor organizations and to promote an awareness of solidarity among workers and between labor and management. Further, another principle, society must acknowledge the priority of labor over capital, one of the most basic principles of Catholic social teaching. This priority is grounded in the fact that labor is always a primary and efficient cause, while capital, the whole collection of the means of production, remains a mere instrument or instrumental cause, a material cause. Further, the goal or end of work, its final cause, is the good of the worker and his family and the common good of the community, ultimately, in fact, the good of the whole human family. Allowing workers to share in the means of production preserves a sense that they are working for themselves, not simply for profits or for a paycheck. Industrialization, which increasingly separates labor and capital, can easily result in a kind of practical materialism. So, one of the phrases that Holy Father uses here, a kind of practical materialism, in which labor is treated itself as a kind of impersonal commodity, as in the phrase, the labor force. The Holy Father defines work as any activity by man, whether manual or intellectual, that helps to sustain his life and provide for his needs. In a created order, only human beings work. They alone are capable of acting deliberately to achieve their own good and the good of the community. Work is natural to humans, then, and perfective of them, enabling them to express their dignity and to grow in virtue. One's work makes family life possible, along with resources for the education and development of the family and the community. No one works in isolation, since every worker enters into the labor of those who have gone before and contributes something to it. Each of these qualities is true of every worker and every kind of work. Hence, every kind of work has equal moral value, stemming from the moral value of persons, and moral value trumps every utilitarian kind of value. These personalist principles bring about, I think, a transvaluation of values with respect to the meaning of work, the ordinary, the common understanding of work. They imply that work is not a curse or even a necessary evil, but rather something good in itself, even when accompanied by toil and suffering. As a human activity placed at the service of persons, any legitimate form of work performed with this intention builds up or perfects the worker and contributes to the common good. At the most important and fundamental level, then, manual and intellectual labor are equal in dignity and moral worth. In discussing various kinds of work, the Holy Father generally places agricultural work and other forms of manual labor first in the list. In Laborem Exercens, for example, he notes, "Toil is something that is universally known, since it is universally experienced. It is experienced by those doing physical work under sometimes exceptionally laborious conditions. It is familiar not only to agricultural workers who spend long days working the land, but also to those who work in mines and quarries, to steel workers at their blast furnaces, to those who work in builders' yards and in construction work, often in danger of injury and death. It is also familiar to those at an intellectual workbench, to scientists, to those who bear grave responsibility for decisions that will have a vast impact on society. It is familiar to doctors and nurses who spend days and nights at their patients' bedside. It is familiar to women who sometimes, without proper recognition on the part of society and even of their own families, bear the daily burden and responsibility for their homes and the upbringing of their children. Since work is a universal calling, it is familiar to everyone." A universal calling. Everyone is called to work to contribute to the upbuilding of the common good. So it's I especially appreciate what he says here about the work that women do, not paid work most of the time, but included in this list, in this category of work which serves others and builds up the human family and, of course, the immediate family. I also like the metaphor of scientists and academics at an intellectual workbench. Right? Makes you feel like you're packing your tools in there. You're going to go to your, I like that image. It made me feel a lot more muscular or something than I used to. Going in to do philosophy, you often feel like it's a little kind of a wimpy occupation or something. But now you can think of yourself as heading into your briefcase, the intellectual workbench. So I love the way he puts things here, very vivid, very concrete. As a young man, Karol Wojtyła worked in a quarry following the death of his father, and later in a chemical plant. From his poems, we know that he found significance even in the art of placing dynamite in the veins of a wall of rock and in the relentless ringing of hammers. These poems are available in English translation thanks to the patience and skill of I don't know how to say his name, Jerzy Terkevich. That's my effort, at that name. And appear in sets of song cycles. These span the years between 1939 and 1978, from his time as a seminarian in Poland until his election as Pope. A second volume of poems written in the intervening years since 1978 appeared last year in 2003 under the title Roman Triptych, Meditations, along with a brief presentation by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, which is actually very well done. Right, so it's a different side to the Cardinal, I think. Even though I actually am part of the Cardinal Ratzinger fan club. And you can go online and find items, like this mug that says, "Giving heresy the smackdown since 1978 or something. So, it's one of my favorite guys, I have to admit. In characterizing John Paul II's theology of work, it might be helpful to recall Aristotle's distinction in the Nicomachean Ethics between praxis and poiesis. In Aristotle's classification, work and art count as productive rather than practical undertakings. They are concerned with producing an instrumental action that aims at some end, rather than with praxis, action that is also an end in itself. Praxis refers to the whole realm of voluntary actions, as these have moral significance and are aided by the various virtues. Poesis is the realm of making and production, sometimes called craft knowledge by translators of Aristotle. And I think one advantage of that term craft is that it captures the skills of the worker as well as the gifts of the artist. To work is to act in such a way as to produce something. One can judge the value of work, therefore, from the side of the product or from the side of the agent. The product of work has its own criteria of excellence. It's a good X or a mediocre X. Right? That's my only use of symbols in this paper, so I was trying to be really good here. It's a good X or a mediocre X, and it has a certain value vis-a-vis the common good, as contributing to political or social or cultural or economic goods. Here there is room for a hierarchy of values, of course, since some things are more necessary for the common good, more difficult to achieve, and you can imagine many other ways of ranking them. Even from the side of the object of work, however, Pope John Paul II continually calls us to place non-personal cultural goods at the service of persons, so that they are judged by whether or not they promote human dignity, family life, religious freedom, and the like. From the side of the subject of work considered as praxis, one can, of course, consider the moral value of the act using standard moral theories, especially the personalist norm, for example, and Aristotle's and Aquinas' list of virtues. But Wojtyła wants to go deeper here into an ontological account of value, perhaps modeled on the opening chapter of Genesis. God saw what he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the later theological summary of the lesson St. Augustine took from the Platonists, that whatever is good. The created world is good because it reflects its maker, who is being itself in goodness, truth, and beauty. Like Gerard Manley Hopkins, Holy Father sees the world as charged with the grandeur of God, and hence human work, human making, as itself a reflection of this grandeur. In this sense of goodness, every morally licit human act has equal value. As he reminds us in Laborem Exercens, each sort of work is judged above all by the measure of the dignity of the subject of work, that is to say, the person, the individual who carries it out. Presupposing that this work constitutes a purpose, at times a very demanding one, of his activity, this purpose does not possess a definitive meaning in itself. That is the object side here. The object of work does not possess a definitive meaning in itself. In fact, in the final analysis, it is always man who is the purpose of work. This passage makes the provocative claim that both the agent of work and the true purpose of work are the person and the good of persons. Might come as a surprise to General Motors to learn that, but there you have it. All right? That what they're about really is to promote the good of persons ultimately. If corporations really took this seriously, it would just transform, it seems to me, our whole economic landscape. Well, this personalist view of work has been sketched in a general way in various papal documents. We can remain puzzled about what it means in the unremarkable day-to-day of our lives. I think poetry can be a great help to us here. In his letter to artists, John Paul II writes that art must make perceptible and as far as possible attractive the world of the spirit, of the invisible, of God. Art has a unique capacity to take one or another facet of the message and translate it into colors, shapes, and sounds which nourish the intuition of those who look or listen. Art slows us down. All right? Joseph Pieper's famous little book tells us that leisure is necessary for culture. I'm sure many of you have read that essay, For the Making of Art. I think leisure is equally necessary for properly experiencing art. There are four main aspects of the personalist understanding of work that emerge from sustained and quiet reflection on the poems of Karol Wojtyła. First, human work continues God's work of creation. Man is called to fill the earth and subdue it, to have dominion over the earth, and so is entrusted with the privilege and responsibility that comes with this vocation. Second, because it is a human activity, work reveals the human being as a person. No other creature works, even though some seem infinitely busier than we are, some types of creatures. They are not exactly working. Work is deliberate and intentional. We leave our mark on the world through our work. It is as though we had stopped to write in our own little place in the cosmos, I was here. All right? By our work, we are in sense announcing our presence, our contribution. Third, work perfects us as persons. It requires the exercise of the virtues and leads us out of ourselves. Even when we work alone, our work builds on and makes possible that of others. In our labors, we are part of a team. Finally, work is an expression of love. From our personal resources of time and strength, we give to promote the good of the world. While working for ourselves and our daily bread, we also work for others, and we find fulfillment in being able to contribute something to the common good. I want to illustrate these themes by drawing on some of the poetry of Karl Wojtyła. The poem sequence called simply The Quarry. It's a sequence of poems. There's 3 poems, and then it has a little postscript really in memory of one of the workers in the quarry who'd been killed during one of the blasts. He was struck by a shard of rock that went all the way through him, basically, and killed him. The poem sequence called The Quarry, written in 1956, beautifully embodies Wojtyła's sense of the deeper significance in every human activity. Listen now. Electric current cuts through a river of rock, and a thought grows in me day after day. The greatness of work is inside man. So here we have the sense that informed by the intention and thought of the worker, work is more than the sum of its effects. Hands are the heart's landscape, we read. Another beautiful line from this poem. And the miner at work is more than a body with arms and muscles worn out by toil. So another brief stanza here. Thought informing his work, deep knotted wrinkles on the brow, and over his head, joined in a sharp arc, shoulders and veins vaulted. So for a moment, he is a Gothic building. Now, that metaphor is a surprising one in this context, perhaps even a bit scandalous as we move from the sweaty to the sublime. Gothic architecture is notorious, of course, for its tendency to raise the mind to God, reflecting his glory and providing a fitting home for the divine presence. The worker here also reflects and radiates God. He is the image of God as maker, an icon of the divine creativity. We shape the world by our work, realizing an intention, not just causing an effect. As if the quarry isn't unlikely enough inspiration for poetry, Wojtyła also writes in honor of the car factory worker and the armaments factory worker. He has 2 poems with those as titles, in fact. These poems capture an anxiety very familiar to those who engage in this kind of work. The car factory worker is asked by, anonymously in a way, rhetorically, what makes you think that man can tip the balance on the scales of the world? But in his own reflections, he confides, my soul is open. I want to know with whom I am fighting, for whom I live. Even deeper concerns engage the worker in the armaments factory. It says, though what I create is not good, the world's evil is not of my making. But is that enough? As deliberate action, of course, work has moral significance. The armaments factory worker consoles himself, do I start wars? How can I know whether I'm for or against? No, I don't sin. Yet the next stanza begins, I could do otherwise. I could do otherwise. Would parts be left out? That's the opening line of the next stanza. We make ourselves by our actions and choices, and surely most deeply by our work and our family life, where the vast majority of our actions are focused. In a later cycle of poems, under the heading Redemption Seeking Your Form to Enter Man's Anxiety, we meet Veronica, who approached Jesus along the way of the cross, wiping his face with her veil. The stuff of ordinary days in me is continually transformed, seeking an outlet, like a river weighed to the bottom by its own weight. The world escapes, not through thought, into the land of meaning alone. Animals do not escape, or men, or flowers in vases, or flowers growing in the meadows of human loneliness, or drops of blood on the forehead of a tortured man. The land of meaning stretches across unfathomed love and leads to it, a step and an introduction. This movement from the material world in itself to its existence in the mind is seen as essential to the journey of visible things, but not as their destination. The land of meaning is a bridge to love, expressed primarily in actions: an embrace, a smile, a cup of water. The poem continues, I wait here for hands with their fill of daily tasks. I wait here for hands bearing ordinary linen. Raise your hands, Veronica, to the land of deepest meaning. Raise your hands then and touch the face of man. I want to turn now to the next theme on your handout there about how work participates in the incarnation, because as I reflected and meditated on these poems, I more and more see this as the main theme, you might say, of the poetry of Karl Wojtyła and later John Paul II. The shift toward work as an expression of love takes us to the heart of, I think, the Holy Father's spirituality of work. The constant theme of his teaching is the centrality of the incarnation and redemption. Christ is at the heart of it, especially as Word made flesh, who assumes human nature, a body, and with it the experience of all humankind. No one has better captured the truth that in Christ God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. Our sorrows and cares are his, and in him they are the sorrows and cares of us all. Our sin is his, taken on himself, right? And in him the horror of sin is experienced and overcome. In his face we see the face of God. Creation is already a revelation of God, of course, a sacrament of his presence, filled with shadows, traces, and images of the Maker, in St. Bonaventure's phrase. It is an incarnation of his plans and purposes. God's work is also his art, since he has need of nothing but creates out of love and generosity. Even when our work involves toil and suffering, we reflect God's image in our work and in our art, and both are meant to be expressions of love. In his reflections on the life of St. Joseph, the father of Jesus, John Paul II notes that work was the daily expression of love in the life of the family of Nazareth. This can sound rather foreign to the religious ear, as though the mundane rhythm of purchasing supplies, doing household chores, and paying bills could compare to the obviously significant expressions of love, some of them miraculous, during the years of Jesus' public life. But that comparison is exactly what is meant here. There is no secular realm on this view. The visible material world, including the human body, is a manifestation of the greater invisible world of the Spirit. Even the most ordinary task is an expression of love. In working, we give of ourselves to service of others. One of the major scripture texts underlying this incarnational view of work is from the letter to the Hebrews. When Christ came into the world, he said, "Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, I have come to do your will, O God." The body assumes lasting significance here as an instrument of love and sacrifice. Human bodies are visible and tangible. They make communion with others possible, providing both a veil for the secret recesses of the heart and a window into the soul through the eyes and face. The body allows us to let ourselves be known, to reach out to others and speak to them. It also allows us to turn away, to close ourselves off from others. The body enables us to fulfill our vocation to exercise dominion over the earth, this universal vocation to work. It's a sign that we are made for communion and a sign of our dependence on others. One of the most moving works in these collected poems is dedicated to Simon of Cyrene, who helped to carry the cross of Jesus. We commonly reflect on this act, I think, from a later point of view and its deep significance as a deed of heroic dimensions. But the poem considers the present experience of Simon at that time, right, coming in from the fields on just another ordinary day of work. Eye to eye with this man, the street, many faces, pounding in my temples as in a forge. Nothing adventurous for me. I don't want to offend. Let me keep myself to myself. No beggar or convict will ever break into me. Neither will God. On the other hand, Simon does not want to turn away from his duty if it is a duty. Right? It's not clear if this is a duty or not. I mean, he gets pressed into service here. But here's what he says. But I want to be fair. This is the threshold. No, don't go beyond. Don't touch my thoughts or my heart. You'll stir something there. This rough handling, this violence. And he dares. he accepts it, a beggar. Later on, falling to the ground with Jesus under the weight of the cross, Simon realizes that in the eyes of the crowd, he has become one with this condemned man. He asks, who is to say which is which, when the weight knocks us both to the ground, me and him? I cannot stand this. Justice is not made of steel. And in the end, Simon decides, no, I don't want merely to be just. I don't want merely to be just. I stand on the threshold, glimpse a new world. Justice calls for rebellion, but rebellion against whom? That's the last question. Is the last line of the poem. The union of Christ with each person is a reality that can either be welcomed or rejected then. Simon comes to acknowledge this, saying, you are accessible, broad. All men are contained in you. It's addressed to Christ. A similar theme weaves through a poem about the Samaritan woman at the well, where she recalls her encounter with Jesus. For him, no need to come out of himself or raise his eyes to guess. He saw me in himself, possessed me in himself. He suffused me with ease, burst my shame in me and the thoughts I'd suppressed for so long. Thought is the meeting place of God with man, the place where he can enter human experience, knowing and being known. To welcome him is to become him, as in the sacrament of communion. In the poem Song of the Inexhaustible Sun, this union inspires a sharp awareness of the infinite distance between human and divine love. If the heart enclosed the world, and the world went up in flames, even if I spent myself, nothing could I give, I know. Yet, day by day, you multiply my feeble, ineffectual lot, surrendering your infinity to my fallible thought. In thought, we can, in a sense, receive the infinite. The corollary to this is that the infinite, entering into our history, also receives our finite thoughts and experiences, our joys and sorrows. Wojtyła titles one of his poems, Invocation to Man Who Became the Body of History. Invocation to Man Who Became the Body of History. I call you and I seek you, O man, in whom man's history finds its body. I go towards you and do not say come, but simply be. Be where there is no record, yet where man was with his soul, his heart, desire, suffering, and will, consumed by feeling, burnt by most holy shame. Be an eternal seismograph of the invisible but real. Finite man is likewise called, I think, here to be a seismograph of the invisible. As John Paul II writes in the letter to artists, I appeal especially to you, Christian artists. I wish to remind each of you that, I love how he always addresses it, I wish to remind each of you, lest you think that you're not really included in the category, you know. He's very personal always. You are invited to use your creative intuition to enter into the heart of the mystery of the incarnate God, and at the same time into the mystery of man. The creation awaits the revelation of the children of God, also through art and in art. While art reveals the world of beauty, it also reveals the artist. Works of art speak of their authors. They enable us to know their inner life. The same can be said to some extent of every human action. Our actions give shape to our souls, and the very toil associated with work can have redemptive significance. Another quotation from the encyclical on work. By enduring the toil of work in union with Christ crucified for us, man in a way collaborates with the Son of God for the redemption of humanity. He shows himself a true disciple of Christ by carrying the cross in his turn every day in the activity that he is called upon to perform. That's the end of the quote. Just every day in what the big, heavy, weightful activities that we can see have a big significance, some serious illness. No, it's just in your everyday work, every action that you're called, that God has called you to each day. If beauty is the goal of art, it might be fair to say that love is the goal of work. The early poem about the quarry urges us, listen to love that ripens in hammers, in even sounds. Love, that's love ripening there in the blows. Hands are the heart's landscape, Wojtyła writes. And his descriptions of workers are marked not by a tone of pity or anger, but by one of admiration, almost of awe. He says, "How splendid these men! No airs, no graces. I know you. Look into your hearts. No pretense stands between us." The focus on human hands brings us back to the common element in work and art. Both involve a form of making. Both involve a form of making, even when the hands are involved only in recording one's thoughts, or typing on the laptop, in the case of the intellectual workbench and so forth. Both the worker and the artist can pray with the psalmist, "Prosper the work of our hands, O Lord, prosper the work of our hands." As a young child, I remember studying the hands of my grandmother with great fascination. They were rarely still, hovering with hummingbird speed over a bowl of string beans waiting to be snapped, coated with flour amid a countertop of rhubarb or huckleberry pies, flying over crochet hooks in a mesmerizing dance, or running a determined brush over her long black hair before going to bed. But in quieter moments, seated on her lap in the old wooden rocker with the world's most comforting squeaky sound, I would study her hands, tanned and weathered by sun and wind, scarred here and there by years of hard work and occasional brushes with the wood stove or old wringer washer. Okay, I'm giving away my age here. Even my grandmother was really, really old, okay, when I was little. They were wrinkled and spotted with freckles and the marks of age. Anyone could have read the love in them. The secret greatness hidden in our ordinary actions finds wonderful voice in the poems of Karol Wojtyła. In an age marked by frenzied activity and a mad consumerism, poetry and the arts more generally may be able to interrupt the perpetual rush hour of our generation and bring us to stillness and silence. I'd like to conclude with the closing lines of the poem entitled "For the Companions of the Road," in which I think all of us are included, I hope. "And yet, if ordinary things fill our days, and all the time some inseparable gesture hides what is within the act, we are still certain the gesture will drop one day, and our deeds will retain only that which most truly exists, fact." Thank you very much. Okay, that's fine.
We have time for a discussion, and Laura is going to recognize Anne, so I can sit down.
Yeah, please. Are there any comments or questions? Yes.
I really liked your discussion of work and looking at it from Pope John Paul II's kind of perspective and how he has this personalist idea of work. And it's a very hopeful message, I think, for workers of all kinds. You might wonder why Aristotle didn't come to this sort of a view that laborers could kind of pursue the good life in their labor without being philosophical, or without having a sort of a strong philosophical life. And what I wonder is, even though I'm attracted to this message, it seems to me and to many people that some work is alienating of human beings. And what I mean by this is that, looking at it from an Aristotelian perspective, some work doesn't require all of the virtues, like the intellectual virtues. And it may be that in some cases people feel that they're not using their intellect in the job that they're employed in. There's some office work. I've done office work where I really felt, at the end of the day, I felt that even though I'd done some valuable work, that my own capacities weren't engaged by that work. And so I wasn't developing myself as a person through that work. So my question is really, how can this kind of alienation be overcome? And could it be that it can only be overcome by Christianity and not by, let's say, a non-Christian kind of philosophical perspective?
Well, like something like Aristotle, in other words. That's a really interesting question. I just want to say something about one part of it anyway, about alienating work. I mean, the Holy Father recognizes that some work can be very alienating and really kind of unworthy, and that there's such a thing as forced labor and so forth. I mean, he himself wasn't working in the quarry because he thought that would perfect him. in the sense of enabling him to become, better, one day a better theologian or teacher or something like that. But, and so, that's a cause for concern at the level of justice and so forth. In other words, looking at work from a more objective point of view or something like that, he would want to say, yes, it's very important that we try to minimize the number of times where people feel that their abilities are not being, their talents are not being developed. And the same is true, he says, for women. Women should be able to develop their talents and capabilities in such a way that this isn't, that they're not penalized for also staying home for a time and taking care of children and so forth. So I think he's very aware of that work can be, in a sense, seem very meaningless and so forth. But I take it the point of the poems about the quarry and the factory workers and so forth is that even in work that just seems very laborious and doesn't seem to be that significant from an objective point of view, it's still work that we do. It's still we're contributing to something. He talks about, for instance, roads. We provide roads. People walk on the roads. I mean, in the quarry, he thinks of this. Ultimately, there's a purpose here that does do some good, for humanity. So even though you're part of it, maybe you think this isn't really fulfilling my capabilities, still it's an important contribution to the common good. And you can see yourself that way. I think, work as an expression of love probably would not have occurred to Aristotle so much, but and he talks about the philosophical life, but I don't want to sell Aristotle short on this. I think that he believes, Aristotle, on his good days anyway, thinks that everybody can engage in sort of philosophical contemplation, or that you do need some leisure for that. And so, of course, it'd be bad to be working 100 hours a week and so forth. But regardless of what your profession is, in a sense, I think he would say we all, as human beings, we need to search for truth, meaning. Even a car factory worker, the armaments worker, in a way, that's part of the point. They're looking for meaning. They're asking ethical questions about their work, and so on. So, but whether we think of work as an expression of love, that's a spirituality of work that probably Aristotle would not have arrived at.
So, do you believe that there's a natural hierarchy of, not hierarchy, but natural, I'll use the word hierarchy, but of work in terms of placing a person's ability and intelligence level with the kind of work they do, and that if their intelligence level and their ability is fulfilled in a certain type of work, that they can achieve happiness in that work, so that not everyone has to have the same kind of work, not everyone has to do the same kind of things, that they can do different things of whatever impact on society, but have the same kind of importance because
Right.
it's inherent in
It's inherent in just doing work. Actually, I think this goes beyond saying that if you find the right jobs at work, you can match yourself up, your talents and abilities with the right job, then you'll find happiness or something, which probably, on a natural level, there's something to be said for that, right? And it's a goal, probably to be sought for. But many people are going to find that their talents and abilities do not match the work that they're doing and so forth, that it's beneath that level of their talent and abilities and so forth. And I think he wants to say that even so, you can still find happiness. That happiness really is giving of ourselves to others. That's how we find happiness. So if we treat this as a service, as an act of love, if we see ourselves, no matter what the work is, no matter how repetitious, and a lot of work in the home is like that, taking care of kids and so forth, that you can still see a deeper meaning in it, a sharing in the redemption of Christ and so forth. Many people are not really reflecting on that all the time. So no one's going to be reflecting on it all the time they're working. But if you can see your work in that perspective, I just think it gives you a different kind of meaning no matter what work you're doing. Bill, did you have your hand up? No, okay, yes, here.
Going back to this earlier comment about whether or not you need some sort of understanding of Christianity in order to arrive at a fuller understanding of work that, for instance, atheists wouldn't be able to arrive at. I've noticed in what you've been saying, and this is a distinction that's been brought up to me before, it's not my own idea, but in the words of JP2 himself, he often has a juxtaposition between work and toil. Mm-hmm. These are two different things. Toil, I think you could easily say, is any kind of work mixed with meaninglessness, futility, suffering of some sort. That I wonder if you need an understanding of the fall before you can understand that difference. Without an understanding of the fall, all work is somehow toil in some way. There's some futility built into it. It's going to fail on some level, slight way, or sometimes an entire work. It seems to me that with an understanding of the fall, there's a question of for instance, in a prelapsarian world, did Adam work? One could argue that in a way he did. He was given tasked by God within the garden.
Names the animals.
But it was work without toil. Is the
Right.
key difference there? And that this goes back to the incarnational understanding of work. That's what redeems the toil, whereas in the ancient world, I don't know if
they don't have an incarnational understanding. Right. I agree that that's probably the point of difference here. If the incarnational aspect I've been talking about here is not to be in Aristotle, but on the distinction between work and toil, I don't want to draw the distinction. I don't want to define toil, I guess, mainly as futility or meaninglessness or something like that. I just want to define toil, I suppose. I think what he means by it, in fact, what the Pope means by it, is simply that it's hard, it wears us down, it takes from us, so that even art takes from us in that sense. I mean, it takes work to prepare a painting or a sculpture or a piece of music or whatever. It takes from us, and maybe takes from us more than it would have in the prelapsarian condition or before the fall or whatever. It takes more out of us, so that it's Adam now, tills the ground and by the sweat of his brow. I mean, maybe he tilled it before and he didn't sweat that much. I don't really know what the distinction was, but I mean, it's not so much that he's doing something totally different, or even that has a totally different meaning, but it's accompanied with suffering of various kinds. You might say, or hardship, difficulty, so forth. So I think that's his distinction. And yeah, the work itself, therefore, he thinks always has its own meaning. God's work has a kind of meaning. We're in the image of God. Our work has a similar kind of meaning, not the same, of course, but and sharing in the creation. But I do think the second part of sharing in the incarnation and the redemption and so forth, I think that's probably just, not going to be found in Aristotle or in a purely philosophical account.
What I found particularly interesting about your paper was the juxtaposition with the poetry, which I realized of Laborum Exercens with the poetry, which I realized was the focus, since I'm more accustomed to reading Laborum Exercens in juxtaposition with all the other social encyclicals, starting with Rerum Novarum. And so listening to these questions, it strikes me that normally if we read something like Rerum Novarum, it's more overtly Thomistic.
Right.
And so that's how it always occurred to me to read Laborum Exercens is within that tradition. So I guess I'm wondering now, like listening to the Aristotle questions, if, and kind of going back and looking at how it does fit together within the tradition of Catholic social encyclicals, if you could come out with a more robust answer to that. But in conjunction, I have a question of my own, which is that it seems Leo XIII is talking an awful lot about labor conditions in Rerum Novarum. And his problem doesn't necessarily seem to be with the type of labor, as with labor conditions.
Right.
And the fact that when hours are so long and wages so low that, an entire family is working 12, 14-hour days, there is no spiritual development, there is no intellectual development. And I'm wondering if you perceive that being continued in the same way in Laborum Exercens, or if there's more, say, critique of like types of work as more fitting or unfitting to human nature, because that doesn't strike me as exactly the distinction that's being made earlier.
No, I don't think that is his main focus. I mean, again, I do think conditions of the workers and so forth are certainly mentioned as having a primary significance from the point of view of justice. So if you're thinking about the laws and so forth of the state and regulations in business and so forth, you have to have OSHA, you have to have all these things to make sure that the conditions of workers, child labor laws and so forth, all of which, of course, at the time of Rerum Novarum, not a lot of that was in place, and since then more of it is. So he is concerned with that, but I think, he definitely wants to go beyond that, which he sees as the kind of first step, in a sense. Justice is a first step, just like in the poem of Simon of Cyrene, right? That sure, justice, we want justice, right? But you can go deeper than that, right? And your work can be an expression of love, even if it's 12 hours a day, even if it's shoveling manure out of the barn or whatever your job might be. In many cases you're going to fill it with. It's not really that. But I think the difference here is this. It's very hard, I think, for us to really get this. Maybe we just don't believe it. But at least I want to be clear about the claim. The claim is that every kind of work is perfective of you, unless it's a morally illegitimate thing to be doing. I remember the woman who wanted to become, she converted because of Jerry Falwell's show or something, and she had been a stripper. And you would think, okay, well now what? She says now she's going to be a stripper for Christ. And you go, okay, well, I don't think that's going to work out, okay? So some forms of work, I think, you can't say this about. But I mean, he wants to say pretty much every other, legitimate form of work is perfective of us. Is perfective of us. Because what we're mainly trying to become is not smarter and better and more educated and talented, and not enhancing our CVs and so forth. We are trying to learn to love. That's what we mainly need to do. Learn how to love. Learn how to go out of ourselves. Learn less selfishness, you might say, and so forth. As we think about marriage, too, it's basically a school of love. And the family's a school of love. In fact, I never connected these before, but we said family work was the daily expression of love in the family of Nazareth. I mean, that was just kind of arresting to me, because I always thought of the family of Nazareth as just kind of floating along, like they do in the paintings, They're always just hanging out, taking a break or whatever. You don't really see them, very often, just really enmeshed in the whole thing, Mary up to her elbows in suds or something, But of course, one of the things I liked, in fact, about the movie The Passion was those flashbacks to the scenes of Mary and Jesus at home, just in their ordinary setting, in a way. She comes out wiping her hands on a towel, and you're almost scandalized, like, whoo! I remember Newman saying that he thought that if the Christians of his day had really thought of the disciples and so on as real figures, he said they would be just as alarmed as if something had come out of a painting, off the wall and started walking around. The figures had come out of the painting. So I think he wants to say not that the work Mary did, for example, or the work Joseph did, or Jesus for 30 years. And, think of that, a carpenter for 30 years. And 30 was old. He was getting kind of old in those days. I mean, into middle life, basically. He's working as a carpenter. I think he wants to say, yeah, but that is really important, right? That was an expression of love, too. So is his death on the cross, of course, in a different way. But, even making the benches, right? Doing the chores, taking out the garbage. That was the daily expression of love. So I just thought there's a really nice image of the importance of work, even the kind of work that we think, well, okay, well, when I'm sitting in my desk at BC, I'm doing the important stuff, but then when I come home and have to empty the dishwasher or whatever, now it's just the garbagey stuff. In fact, actually, one of the things that got me started, I don't want to take up all the rest of my time here, but one of the things that got me interested in this topic in particular was thinking about the work that women do in connection with some feminist authors, Naomi Wolf for one. But a lot of, I think the picture that we had in the 70s, some of us, we first read about the women's movement, what the ideal society would look like, is that, the husband and wife are going to split everything right down the middle, 50-50, every chore, every task, maybe you'd pay half the bills and they'd pay the other half, I don't know. So you're going to try to equalize it all out somehow. And it should be just sort of interchangeable. If you could do anything they're doing, you could go out and change the tires or whatever you guys do, and they could do all of your stuff. They can take care of the babies and so forth. And I think men can do a really good job of changing diapers for one. I mean, they can do that. But I think what got left out of there, I mean, or implicit in that, in a sense, was this kind of feeling like, well, we women have been underappreciated in the work we're doing here, and like men sort of look down on this work. And maybe we start looking down on it too. Like this is just ordinary, boring work. I mean, actually several authors, I don't want to scandalize anybody here, but since our keynote speaker used the F word, I'll risk this one. Several refer to it as shit work. Who's going to do the shit work? And that included taking care of the children. Giving them their bath, feeding them supper, putting them to bed. And thought, that's shit work? I mean, that did scandalize me. I thought, well, no, wait a minute. And so I started thinking, I guess, much more about how to think about that kind of work. If I don't want to think about it that way, what would be a better way to think about it? And I found a lot of help here in the poetry of John Paul II, and I probably didn't read Laura Garcia's that way the first time through it either. And so you're talking about how to connect those up in a stronger way. I mean, I would like you to do that. That would, because I can't think of anything right now, but I mean, that seems like an important thing to do.
Sort of along the lines of that, could you comment on women simultaneously working in the that world?
Yeah, so questions about combining work and home and family and so forth for women. It's a huge problem for us, and one that takes up a lot of my time and thought, and I'm sure for a lot of other women as well. I think that's very hard to do, very hard to combine the two in a way that's that preserves your sanity and health and so forth. So let me just say that up front. I don't think there's a kind of a rosy solution where it all falls into place and then you go hand in hand, towards the sunset or something like that. I mean, I think it's really hard, and it continues to be hard. And I think it continues to require a lot of flexibility, I guess, for one thing, and revision of your plan. However you're working it out, you have to be always ready to shift it and say, well, I might have to do more of this, less of that, and so forth. You just have to be flexible. That's one of my pieces of advice here. But as far as the theory in a way goes, I really did like, and I'd forgotten that this was in the document on work, actually, and reading it again. I looked all through the documents on women. I couldn't find it. On the family, couldn't find it. It's in this document on work where there's an extended passage where the Pope talks about the work of women and what would be just and so forth. And he's more explicit than anywhere else, I think, in any of his documents, that the primary vocation of a mother, right, is in the home and with the children. That's her primary vocation. It's very important. Other things should not be sacrificed to it. At the same time, right, it might almost seem paradoxical, like, well, you can suggest this. I don't know how we're going to pull it off. So that's where I'm talking about the practical part of it. But as far as the theoretical part goes, is at the same time, this should not mean that a woman cannot develop her talents, receive an education, exercise her gifts, and so forth in the public domain. Right? So that what is needed in society is a culture that makes that possible for women. Not just possible, maybe even encourages it, makes it easier, right? So that women can take time off and then come back without being penalized or looked down upon, or they can go on the mommy track, or however it's called these days, without everybody, kind of looking down their nose at them. Oh, you're in the mommy track. Not serious, obviously. I mean, I had friends, women in academic life, in philosophy, graduate programs, and so forth, being told not to make sure you don't have any kids. In fact, just getting married, for a woman, not a man, of course, but for a woman, just getting married means you're not serious anymore about doing philosophy. And not for the men, but for the women. And if you have a child, that's it. You have just proved yourself to be, totally not in the game or something like that. So those attitudes, it seems to me, we have to really go after those kinds of attitudes. And as long as women keep accepting the status quo, that of course, this is how everybody thinks, so I have to think like that too and just live with it, which is kind of what I thought when I was first coming through. I thought, oh well, it's a bad world out there, you just got to deal with it. But I don't think that anymore. Right? Times are changing, and those of you in the younger generation, I think there's some pushing back, right, on the part of women, and we should be really loud about that. No whispering there. Shouts are needed. Okay? Yeah.
Sorry. I'm a political science major, so it's kind of a political science question, but what do you think about, the increasing role of mechanization? We're saying, theoretically you can have a factory that used to be run by, 300 people, now it's completely automated, run by 5. How does he reconcile that with the value of the individual human being and work?
Well, mechanization, I think, he thinks is basically a good in a way, because what some people have been mentioning is this monotonous routine work can be very mind-numbing and, not that interesting and so forth, not that engaging. So to some extent, that's a positive, right, if you can mechanize more of that kind of work. I mean, I was sympathetic with the question about the jobs because I worked one summer at a mortgage company, and it had nothing to do with money. All I did all day long was run the Xerox machine. I'm surprised I'm not dead, chemotherapy or whatever, the rays. And you just copy like 500 or 1,000 pages of stuff every day, and sometimes the same stuff over and over. So didn't we already have a copy of this? We have, but we're making copies of everything, And you thought a monkey could do this, or a machine, right? So to some extent, you might say mechanization can be a plus, right? But what needs to be done is putting the person first here, right? Trying to provide retraining programs, education, severance pay, and so forth. They're trying to help people whose jobs have been replaced to enter into a different field of work, right, or related, or whatever, given whatever their interests are. I mean, actually, my father was once in that position of getting laid off when they quit cutting down trees out in the Northwest because of the spotted owl. Actually, he probably got a job looking for spotted owls. So it can work out. I won't finish that story. But okay, any other questions? Yeah.
This is kind of a methodological question / personal question about the way you're approaching the poetry. And I was struck last semester, I think it was, Cardinal George was down here from Chicago and gave a talk, and his title was The Papacy of John Paul II. But he ended up just talking about the Roman Triptych poems and talking about it all through that framework. So I guess I was wondering what your reflections on someone who's studied Pope's thought and put it to philosophical and theological work. What role do the poems play? How do they enhance your understanding of the Holy Father's thought or develop it, or what role do they play in your approach?
Well, I guess I've read the other volume, the second volume of poems, and in a way you might say they really are the papacy of John Paul II. I mean, they are on one of the set of themes is, of course, the paintings in the Sistine Chapel and so forth, and reflections on those. The first one, though, I think I really liked a lot, and I thought it was compared very favorably and similarly to some of the earlier poems here, the poem about the stream and so forth, and which is really a beautiful metaphor. So, and that seems to relate more closely to his sense of nature and incarnational sense and so forth. But the others are a lot more explicitly theological, you might say, or a lot more spiritual and so on, overtly. But one thing that attracts me about the earlier work is that much of it, of course, is written in a time when you couldn't be explicit about transcendence, supernatural, religious faith, and so forth. You had to be very indirect. Really had to be whispering, I guess, in the terms we heard at the beginning. So it seems to me it calls you, because it's less explicit, he says things that are pretty odd at times. I mean, that just, like I expected to read some nice poems, like just someone whip through them. And, almost all of them are very, in some ways, very difficult. I mean, you can't just read the face and then move on. You have to try to figure out, well, what on earth is this supposed to be pointing towards? So in that way, I sort of like the fact that they point towards some of these themes in a pretty explicit way, and it lets you sort of decode them in a sense, you might say. You can see them expressing and pointing to things that are really very deep, theological claims about the Eucharist and so forth. And yet, at the same time, they can be read at another level. They can just be read about the workers or the questions people ask themselves and so forth. So I thought of them in a way, the earlier ones, as much more existential, in a way it's revealing more about him, about the way about his soul, you might say, the soul of that artist. And so since he's, I think, really a saint, I'm just going to hazard that guess. I thought it was a joy, to get a better insight into him.
Well, let's thank Laura for